Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening and welcome to yet another edition of the Special Focus. I am Zahid Jadwat coming to you live from Durban, South Africa via the various platforms of Salam Media, facebook.com/Salam Media. Salam Media is also coming to you live on youtube.com/Salam Media. And of course, on our audio stream, that is on our website, salammedia.com/listen-live. Of course, if you'd like to contribute to the discussion that we are going to be unpacking, I'll introduce you to the discussion in a short while. But just a reminder that if you'd like to participate in the discussion, you can definitely send your comments and questions through our WhatsApp number. That number is 061 Alternatively, you can tweet and tag at Salam Media. Don't forget to use the hashtag the special focus. If you'd like, you may also leave a comment or question below our Facebook or YouTube live videos. So, gender based violence. Now, you've probably heard this abbreviation many times, especially over the last 16 days or so, as we've been experiencing these 16 days of activism against gender based violence. But just how much exactly do you know about this scourge and this evil form of violence that is being perpetrated mainly against women, and how do we continue this campaign to eradicate GBV beyond just the official 16 days which have been stipulated? What can you and I do as individuals to play our part in combating this evil crime and the second pandemic, as it has been described by our president, Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa? And so this is exactly what we are seeking to unpack tonight to help you get a better understanding about GBV and most importantly, find solutions to the problem, because that, of course, is our main aim this evening. Amara Garda is the head of politics, South African and international affairs at the MSA Union. She joins us now to chat to us about this very important topic tonight. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening and welcome to the show, Amara.
Walaikum salam. Shukran so much for having me. And more importantly, for having this discussion. I don't think we can speak about this issue enough. So, shukran so much.
Definitely. And we also have from Bidzai Elizabeth Chiduri, and she is the gender coordinator at the Foundation for Human Rights. Good evening to you as well, and thank you for joining us to discuss this topic, which I cannot adequately stress the importance of. Good evening to you, and welcome to the show.
Good evening, Zahid, and good evening, Amara, and good evening to the viewers. Thank you so much for having me on this show. And just like Amara said, it's a very timely discussion, especially now that we are in 16 days of activism. So it's very good that we're having this discussion.
Indeed. So let's begin with you, Elizabeth. So, to put context to this discussion, let's find out what exactly is GBV. When we mention GBV, what are we speaking about? And it's a really important question, I feel, because in fact, when I was promoting the show for this evening on my social media platforms as well, many people asked me what is GBV. They unfortunately, despite the activism that's going on, some people still don't know what GBV means. So if you can unpack that for us, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Zahid. Well, gender-based violence is a term, it's an umbrella term actually, for any harmful act that is perpetrated against a person's will, and that is based on socially ascribed differences. And we usually refer to these as gender differences between mainly males and females. Gender-based violence can manifest itself physically, it can be sexual, or it can be mental harm or suffering, or even threats of such kind of acts, or coercion, or any other deprivations of liberty. And gender based violence can occur in public or in private spaces.
Thank you so much for that. Now, Amara, for you, what would define gender-based violence? What does it mean for you? And does this term apply exclusively to violence against women, or does it encompass violence perpetrated against men as well?
So I would say technically it doesn't include women only and it doesn't exclude men. What it basically means at its core is violence perpetrated against someone on the basis of their gender. So that could be male, that could be female, that could be conceptions of what it means to be male and female, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And I would say, what's important is to realize that essentially violence is only perpetrated against people when they are vulnerable. or when they are marginalized. So, in our case, the reason gender based violence takes on a specific women lens is because women are the most marginalized in society. So you do get cases of men who are marginalized and they would then be victims of GBV based on conceptions of what it means to be a man. Women are disproportionately affected by this, and that's why the conversation tends to become, why are women going through this and why are men the perpetrators?
So we'll get to the causes of GBV in a moment, but I just want to unpack further uh, relating to one of the statements which you made in this response earlier on. So you say there is a disproportionate result of women being targeted and vulnerable. What could be leading to this discrepancy? Why is it that women are generally more vulnerable than men in our society in particular?
Well, yeah, in a South African society, there's no way you can talk about it without referring to the economic inequalities. So we often discuss inequality as if it's something that's purely racial. And that's obviously because of apartheid. But I think we forget to look at how prevalent inequality is amongst the genders. So, in terms of when you live in a capitalist society, your economic opportunity, your economic resources, your economic ownership pretty much dictates everything in terms of power in society. And women in South Africa are incredibly poor on all of those levels that I just mentioned. So economically, women are really in the worst situation in South Africa, and that's a huge driving force, I would say, for why the marginalization happens. But it's not just an economic issue. It's not just something where you can say if we have equality, all of this will go away. A lot of it obviously has to do with ideologies and different ideas about what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man and what your role ought to be in society based on that gender. So historically, we know that misogyny has been pretty much the way that the world is structured. And sort of the combination of capitalism and misogyny or patriarchy is pretty much a breeding ground for oppressing women.
Hmm. So it would appear that the inequality between men and women actually transcends beyond, financial inequality. It's also certain conceptions that have been around with us as culturally, whether socially, etc. So Elizabeth, coming to you now, what would we call the causes of gender-based violence, particularly in a South African context?
Thank you, Zahid. I think Amira has actually, alluded to some of them is the gender inequalities, the power imbalances between men and women. And these are mainly behavioral. So you find that in terms of attitudes, the way men respond to women and the way women respond to men. In terms of gender inequalities, we're looking at structural factors. We're looking at access to services, basic access to services. For instance, if women do not have access to equal economic opportunities, that already places them in a vulnerable position, and that is the problem, particularly here in South Africa. One other root cause is the disregard for human rights in itself. Gender-based violence is really a serious violation of women and girls' rights, continues to undermine the health, the security, and the dignity of thousands of women in South Africa, particularly. So, with South Africa, you see that there's so many violations taking place because people do not have access to their rights. There's a lack of basic services. I mean, even if you just read the news or just see the news, you can see there's a lot happening in terms of lack of basic services where people are living, and those who are hardest hit are women. So in South Africa, those are the main contributing root causes of gender-based violence: the power imbalances, the gender inequalities, and the disrespect for human rights.
And thank you so much for that. So I just want to expand on that a little bit, especially that last point which you mentioned, disregard for human rights. So where does gender-based violence fall within the broader issue and problem of disregard for human rights?
I mean, when it's just talking about, for instance, in South Africa, we have a very great constitution here in South Africa. We have the Bill of Rights, which has really all the basic fundamental freedoms. These are your right to health, your right to safety, your right to dignity, your right to equality. And you find that when incidents of gender based violence happen, they violate these very particular rights. And if
Mm,
they violate these particular rights, that means a violation has happened in terms of the Constitution. And this person who has been violated cannot be able to access their rights. Their enjoyment of their rights has been affected. So, for example, if a woman is killed, for instance, or her right to life has been violated, and in the
mm,
manner in which we look at the right to health, if women do not have access to safe reproductive and sexual health services, their right to health is affected. If women do not have access to safety within their work environment, if the women are not even safe in the streets, for instance, that means their right to safety is violated. Their right to security, to dignity, to bodily autonomy, to be able to do what they want with their bodies. If a woman is raped, someone has violated her right to her dignity, her right to her bodily integrity, her right to do what she wants with her body. So this is what is continuing to happen within South Africa. If you look at the annual crime statistics that were revealed by SAPS, for instance, between 2019 and 20, they reveal
mm,
that rape and sexual assault has increased by 1.7% and 4.2% respectively. Rape and sexual assault account for almost 93% of all sexual offenses. So you see that this is really something that is really affecting us in South Africa, it's particularly South African women. Rape and
mm.
sexual offenses are a huge problem.
Yeah, and those are actually shocking statistics which you mentioned, and it comes as no surprise against the background of violence that occurs in South Africa, and that would lead one to the question of how prevalent. What does this tell us about the prevalence of GBV in South Africa, Amara?
Yeah, I think, the stats is something that most of us have spoken about and most of us know off the back of our hand, which is really unfortunate because the numbers are incredibly high. But I think a basic way of explaining it conceptually would be to say, I, as a woman, I can't think of one place in South Africa where I have felt safe. Safe meaning
Mm,
not concerned about who walks into the room, not concerned about who's on the other side of the door, not concerned when someone knocks on that door, not concerned when I get a text. That sort of safety, that sort of just liberation is pretty much non-existent. And it's not just for women in South Africa. Obviously, we know that crime in general is a big problem, but I think the nature of sexual crimes is so dehumanizing and so degrading and so painful that it's literally something that you think about all the time. It's something that you quite literally have to plan your life around. So things like, forgetting to put the alarm on at your house or forgetting to close your window, those are not just small things. Those are really something that feels like a gateway to being violated. And I think what's really sad about gender-based violence in particular is even your house is not a safe place. Because we know the nature of gender based violence, about 50% of gender based violence is perpetrated by someone that you know. So, locking your doors and putting your alarm on doesn't really protect you from someone that's in your house when that's
mm,
most likely to be the perpetrator. So, in terms of prevalence, South Africa is ridiculously filled with these stories. It's something that happens publicly, it's something that happens privately, and essentially it's something that you can't really escape from. If you just had to Google really today something like sexual assault, something like rape, you would find a new article every few hours. which really speaks to the prevalence of it. I think beyond just statistics, which sometimes makes us feel like it's not happening to real people.
Mhm. And I suppose that's what differentiates between normal general crime that occurs in South Africa, the general crime problem. Of course, we do have a serious issue of crime in South Africa in general. It's something we all have to face. But I think that's what differentiates between normal crime, general crime, and GBV, because GBV is something that occurs many times within your household. Uh, so I think that's what makes it different to general crime. So Elizabeth, if I could just ask the technical team to bring Elizabeth onto the screen for the viewers to see. So Elizabeth, if Amara is describing this situation where there's a sense of the non-existence of safety as a woman, how would you describe the atmosphere of living in a society where GBV is prevalent as a woman?
Thank you very much, Zahid, for your question. I think Amara put it very, very beautifully, actually, to just say when you don't feel safe, that feeling of just not being able to be safe, whether you're in your home, whether you're on the street, whether you're in the public in a public building, you just don't feel safe. It really hit home for me when during one of the several meetings that we've been having previously, a woman commented and in that meeting, and she said, I don't know if I'm going to be alive in January. What are we doing about gender-based violence? I don't know if I'm going to be alive because I'm not safe in my home, I'm not safe on the street, I'm not safe in my place of work, I'm not safe anywhere. I could die anywhere. Anything can happen to me at any point. So that really, really, you really stop and think about it and say, that's true. As a woman, I constantly live in fear. You constantly live in fear of your life. And I don't think that is the society that we aspire to live in. When we talk about a just and equal society, it's a society where you feel you want to fulfill your potential. How are you able to fulfill your potential if you're worrying about your safety at every single moment?
Mm. So, how do we convince someone who refuses to accept the fact that gender-based violence is a real issue? It is prevalent, and if one looks at the estimates, you'd notice that some estimates suggest that up to 28% of women in South Africa alone have reported being raped in their lifetime. And I know the sad fact is that I know one or two women whom I've come across who say it's just a media hype which doesn't show you the violence perpetrated by women against men. And this is a sad misconception that is prevalent within our society. So, how do we fight this misconception about gender based violence? Of course, it is an ideological problem. When people are refusing to understand what is the issue at hand, how do we tackle this? Amara?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I I have I have as well, unfortunately, interacted with people who sort of want to downplay how severe this issue is, and I think a big part of it might come from the fact that people don't like to feel unsafe. So in some ways, it's easier to sort of pretend like what's dangerous doesn't really exist. But I would say that, you know, those people who want to deny the severity of the issue, if they are women, I would ask them, then are you admitting that you feel safe in this country? Because Elizabeth pointed it out really well. It's literally everywhere, and I don't know any woman that's sort of able to let their guard down. Even subconsciously, we do small things that keep us safe. And I would really be, I think I'd be hard pressed to find a woman that has never had to think about that safety. In terms of women perpetrating violence against men, I think the problem of bringing that issue up when people are trying to highlight the issue of GBV is it sort of implies that you can't bring attention to the problem of violence in general. Um, I don't see how violence against anyone is ever justifiable, and
Mm,
I think that's what the crux of the matter needs to be, that violence in itself is not productive to society, and it's a violation of everything that our society wants to be or claims to be, whether that's perpetrated by men or women is pretty much irrelevant. The bottom line needs to be that violence is unacceptable. And then if you look at the numbers, then you will undoubtedly realize that violence is perpetrated disproportionately by men. Now, this is interesting because a lot of
Mm,
people, I think, know that violence is perpetrated by men, but it's also perpetrated against men as well, more than it's perpetrated against women. This is just violence in general. But when we specifically speak about the nature of sexual violence, I think we can't classify that as simply being, a pun in a fight,
mm,
punching each other over something where you disagree. That's not the nature of sexual violence, and it's not the nature of violence against women in particular. Um, I think what people really need to understand is that violence always has a reason behind it. And when it's violence perpetrated by a man against a woman, there are very specific reasons why that happens. And it's not easy to just say these are the stats, full stop, because a lot of this goes unreported. And I think what people should really answer in their own personal lives is, do they feel 100% safe being alone with every single man they've ever met in their lives? And I can almost guarantee you that there is not one woman I know that can say, yes, I 100% trust every single man I've ever met in my life. And that's a problem. That shouldn't really be a way that we live. So I think forgetting the politics and the ideologies, and I know people have problems with labels and different campaigns. At the end of the day, is violence acceptable? No. At the end of the day, is sexual violence acceptable? No. So if we want to be a society where there is no violence from one gender to the other and just in general, then we really need to start supporting anti-violence movements no matter how they look.
mm. And I think that just expands on the definition of gender-based violence. But of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has struck this year, 2020, and many countries have went into lockdown at some point during this year. And during the lockdown, there was talk of an increase in gender-based violence occurring, and that, of course, is probably perhaps I would pinpoint it because because people are at home now and confined within their homes. So it's an environment that enables gender-based violence to increase. So I want to hear from you now, Ms. Chiduri. How has the COVID-19 lockdown exacerbated the issue of gender-based violence? And two questions here. Uh, Firstly, is how has it exacerbated the gender-based violence issue of gender-based violence? And secondly, uh, there were measures which were implemented and announced by the government to combat this increase. And now that question would be how have these measures worked during the lockdown?
Thank you very much, Zahid, for that question. During the COVID pandemic, women have really been the hardest hit. They've been the hardest hit because the pandemic is unfolding in a context where gender-based violence already existed. So women are facing a twofold crisis: the crisis of COVID, the crisis of gender-based violence. And this has resulted in, devastating and a deadly impact on women and girls' lives. When you look at the measures that were put in place once the pandemic hit, there was the lockdown where women were everyone, not just women, everyone was forced to stay in their homes. And whilst we mentioned it earlier, home has not really been the safest place for women. So it might be safe for more men than it is for women, and it might be safe in terms of COVID, but in terms of GBV, the home is not the safest place for women. So gender based violence continued existing in this context. So you can imagine what a lot of women had to go through. The Foundation for Human Rights during this time actually did a survey looking at gender based violence during the COVID, and it looked at 127, it surveyed 127 community-based advice offices. These are your local human rights offices that are found within local communities, which usually assist communities with legal aid, paralegal advice, and with human rights issues. and they highlighted the main issues that were impacting them and their communities in during the lockdown. And 54% of the community-based advice offices reported an increase in GBV cases across all the provinces, with the Free State having the highest, and this was at 82%, and with KwaZulu-Natal coming after that, which had 65%. So that already shows you that even though in terms of COVID, uh, being home was meant to be in part of the safety protocol for women,
mm,
that is not the case at all. It is far, far, far divorced from that. So you'd see an increase in gender-based violence. Women, a lot of women were affected during the COVID, during the lockdown, especially. There are a lot of women who are for example, a lot of women in the informal sectors. They did not have access to workplaces. So, which meant they didn't have any income, which meant they didn't have any food. So, you found out that during the lockdown, the survey also revealed that the biggest issue facing communities was the lack of food. People didn't even have food where they were living. So, you can imagine having to face gender based violence, having to face COVID in itself, having no food. That already shows you how difficult it has been for women in terms of just having a livelihood. If you don't have any income, you don't have any food, what kind of life is that?
mm,
So
mm-hmm. Continue.
yes, almost many communities reported that their children were not able to access the feeding schemes, which some was their primary source of food. For example, 91% of the community advice offices reported that there were no local school feeding schemes, and this is because children were now at home and they were not at school, so there was no access to those nutrition programs. And the fact that women were also at home, there was an increased burden of care, particularly when you're looking at women. Women are the most, when you look at the numbers, women are the ones that do the caregiving roles the most. So there was an increased burden of care, having to look after kids in an environment where you don't have money, you are in an abusive home. That was really very, very, very difficult for women.
Mhm. And Amara, I can see the discomfort which is you seem to possess as you hearing what the Foundation for Human Rights found during the lockdown. I think 54% reported increase in gender-based violence across the country during the lockdown. That's really alarming. So your thoughts on the increase of gender-based violence during the lockdown before we move on, Amara?
Yeah, I think even these numbers, like I've been saying, is doesn't capture the full picture, because we know the nature of gender-based violence is that it's an underreported crime.
Mm,
And I think why I react the way I react is that every single time, no matter how many times we speak about these issues, the sort of the audacity of men just always gets to me, and sort of the ability to sort of use women as the scapegoat and the sort of end point of every sort of difficult period in your life is something that happens all the time. So I think COVID was hard for women because of everything that Elizabeth mentioned, and also because men were probably going through a lot of difficult times themselves, and the people that pay the price for that is generally the women that live with men. And yeah, to me, it's just, this is not a society that I want to live in. It's really, really not.
mm. And that just leads me to a thought that I thought of, like just as you were mentioning that. Is this perhaps because we've led a society where women are generally dependent on men? Is the way our society seems to be working?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So the economic issues that I mentioned earlier, if we take like a scenario which is all too familiar, unfortunately, if there's a woman and she's getting beaten by her husband on a very systematic basis. Let's say they have two children. The husband's the breadwinner in the family. Let's say the wife doesn't work. If you decide you've had enough and your husband has driven you out of your home and you are going to leave that house, you leave that house earning nothing. Where do you go for safety? Where do you go for literally food, literally bread and water. What do you do with your kids? Do you say, okay, I'll leave my kids with him because he will keep paying for their education? Do you take them with? And now all of you are starving and pretty much have no no economic opportunity to get anywhere. So in many cases, there's sort of this trade-off between I take the beating knowing that my finances are okay because he looks after me, he gives me what I need and what my kids need, or I leave and I'm physically okay from him, but I'm still not in a safe place because where do I live now? Where do I get that money to sustain myself and my family? So that sort of economic dependence is a massive explainer for why this happens, and I think men know this as well. If you are the breadwinner, like I said, in a capitalist society, you're the breadwinner. For you, that's a power. That's a power that you know the other person doesn't have. And I think that is something that's held over women's heads very consistently.
Mhm. And I think that's something that would require a major shift in the way that our society operates. And Elizabeth, I will get to you in a moment to expand this discussion. But about how do you propose we change the way society functions? To create less dependence on men for women.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I would love an entire economic restructuring, but I think we're a bit far away from being ready for that. But in terms of it starts at really basic levels. So if we look at education, education in itself, women disproportionately are dropping out of school for many reasons. One thing is period poverty. That's one thing. So women don't have enough resources to be able to afford menstrual products. So they end up missing school every time they get their period, which is consistent. So let's say every month I miss school for a week, 10 days, because I'm on my period and there's nothing that I can do about it. I can't go to school because I don't have anything that I can wear when I go to school and I'm on my period. So if you take that, eventually at some stage you miss out on so many weeks of education a year simply because you can't afford a menstrual product every month. So there's issues like that end up negatively impacting the education of the girl child. So it starts quite literally from there. But all the way through, if we look at who earns the most in our economy, tertiary education is absolutely key in order to move up in terms of economic social ladders. How many women actually get to that level, to actually being tertiary educated? The numbers are shocking, and this is not necessarily because there are economic barriers, but a lot of these are social barriers. So this concept of a girl doesn't have to study forever, or a girl doesn't need to finish matric, or a matric is enough, and then after that she'll get married, have kids, and that's pretty much the rest of her life sorted. Women don't need jobs. Those sort of discussions in a normative sense, why I say normative is because if it's a woman that's choosing to live a life of no job, that's a very different story, and that's great. But this conception of women shouldn't have jobs, women shouldn't work, women shouldn't get educated, they don't deserve education, that will literally hinder women financially forever, because as it stands now, women are employed mainly in the informal sector, which we know is very precarious. Things like lockdown were horrible for people in the informal sector, but also that income is not sustainable, and it's not a big source of income. It's literally just getting by on a day-to-day basis. So I would say education, in terms of educating the girl child and carrying on all the way until employment, is a huge, huge thing that needs to be addressed.
And I think there's much more scope for this very question to, go deeper and get some more in-depth analysis, when it comes to the discussion of the impact of social welfare organizations and the social structure of the society that we live in. But I think for tonight, let's stick to our topic of gender-based violence. So coming back to you, Elizabeth, as a male, I wouldn't be subjected to gender-based violence in the sense that most women would be subjected to it in that context. But I belong to a society, and we all coexist within the society. So, how does gender-based violence affect all of us as people who exist within a united society? Elizabeth.
Thank you, Zahid. Thank you for that question. I mean, as I had already alluded earlier, that gender-based violence affects our rights to health, our rights to equality, our right to dignity, our rights to participate in an economy. So, in when you're looking at that, and when you're looking at, if you're just looking, for instance, at the structure of just a home, where you have a male and a female, and you have children, and within that home, each one has a role to play within the home. In the current structure of what the family looks like, you have the man who's working and provides for his family, and you have the woman who's working within the home, who's providing for the family as well, and cooking and cleaning and doing all those jobs. For everything, for that system to work, each one has to play their own role. So where one is not able to play their role, it means that there's a gap, and that affects how the whole system works. And I think COVID really put that and turned it out on its head, because people were not allowed to go to work, to leave their homes. So people were literally not working or going to the office, but they were working within their homes if they were able to. And those that were not um working, which meant that they were not able to have access to the income that they could to support their families. And that meant increased stress. Increased stress would mean that this could manifest in itself in violence in itself. So when you're looking at when you're looking at the factors that affect all these things, you find that there are also risk factors to GBV. And in a home where people are unstressed, you find that they are much more happier. They're able to fulfill their potential. In a home where they are very stressed, none of that happens. So that means, on a bigger scale, gender-based violence affect our ability as a country even to just be successful. If you look at the economic impact of gender-based violence, I think KPMG did a survey in 2014 that revealed that the economic impact of gender-based violence was between I think it was almost 1.9 of our GDP as a country. So that alone is staggering in itself when you just look at it. If we have women who are living healthy lives, who are fulfilling that potential, I think we would do better as a country. And if you look at where South Africa is right now, we have so many problems. We have so many problems in basic access to services. We have so many problems in the sense that people do not have access to their rights. The Foundation for Human Rights did a survey back in, I think it was in 2018, and was looking at attitudes at constitutional awareness. And about 40% of the respondents knew their constitutional rights, but the rest didn't. So the majority of people aren't aware of their rights, and they're not able to claim them. And if they're not able to claim them, it means they continue to live in lives where their rights continuously are systematically violated. And this is what you see in South Africa. You see where people are unhappy. You see there's a lot of unhappiness that is expressed even during the service protests. You see even what is happening in institutions. So all of these things intersect with one another, and all of these things now manifest themselves in when you're looking in gender-based violence. Some of these things, the gender inequalities, now manifest themselves in gender-based violence. So as men, we really have to come together, along with women, along with all the other sectors. We all have to. It's not, when we're saying gender-based violence, as we said earlier, it's not just a woman problem. It's men and women, and also gender non-conforming persons as well. It's for everyone. We all have to. We are all affected by gender-based violence, and it requires effort from all of us to really strengthen our responses to gender-based violence, educate ourselves. As Amira mentioned, education. I cannot underscore the importance of education. It's really important that we unlearn all these violent behaviors and these attitudes. We need gender transformative norms to be able to counter the toxic masculinities that enable violence to happen.
All right. If you've just joined us, it's 43 minutes past 7 p.m. And if you've just joined us, this is the special focus. My name is Zahid, Jadwat, and we are together right up until 8 p.m. Our topic this evening is we are discussing gender based violence. And this, of course, as the 16 days of activism against gender based violence nears its end. In fact, I think it ends tomorrow, the 10th of December. And we are going to begin wrapping up this discussion shortly as we head towards 8 p.m. And my guest this evening, let me just remind you, is firstly we have Amara Gauta, who is the head of politics, South African and international affairs at the MSA Union, and we also have Rumbidzai Elizabeth Chuduri, who is the gender coordinator at the Foundation for Human Rights. Now, coming back to our discussion, so we of course we do understand that there is a serious issue at our hands here, in our hands at the moment as we speak, and that's exactly the reason why we are having this discussion, because we have a serious problem with gender-based violence, which is prevalent in our society, unfortunately, at this stage. And that would, I think, now speaking about it is one thing, but we also need to find solutions. So, what sort of role do I want to first focus on the role of men within our society? What sort of role do men have to play in terms of combating gender-based violence? Amara?
So I think, we discussed quite a lot about how women feel about GBV and how scared we are to become victims and or survivors. You survive if you're lucky. But all of us sort of live with that fear. And I would love for men to start living with a fear of being a perpetrator. Because I think that's pretty much the only way we're going to get it into society to understand that it really is so prevalent that while women are scared of being violated, men need to become scared of violating. It's not something that can be taken lightly. It's not something that men can sit back and say, I would never do that, or none of my friends would do that, or none of my family members would do that, or I know him, he's a good guy. Men really need to grapple with the fact that this is so prevalent that there are definitely men that you know personally who have perpetrated some sort of violence. And now remember, violence is not just physical, it's emotional, it's financial, it can be social. There's lots of different ways of perpetrating violence, but I really want men to be scared of becoming a perpetrator to the point where they don't. That's what I would really like to see. In terms of how do men actually contribute to the fight against GBV, I would say, yeah, education is something that we've been mentioning quite a lot, and education, I think, is not an end in and of itself. It needs to be used. So I think men really need to do their own sort of research and their own sort of surveying of what actually women are going through in the country, and women in their lives as well. So even as a man, speak to the closest 5 women in your life and ask them questions. When do they feel safe? What measures do they take to, sort of try and stay out of trouble? What event in their life made them the most scared? These types of questions, so that you can really understand what you as a man need to be doing in your own personal capacity. I'm not expecting every single man to come out and protest with us. And I think the point of protests is not because it looks nice on camera and crowds are fun to be in. The point of protest is for behavior to change. So I'm much less interested in whether a man is comfortable holding up a poster. I'm more interested in what is that man doing to the women in his life. So I would really start with that basic thing of having a discussion with the women in your lives and asking them, have I ever done anything that's made you feel uncomfortable? What are there certain boundaries that I'm not aware of that you would like to set up? It's really, at the end of the day, a human issue, which can really be solved by treating it like that. But yeah, I would say that's the one thing. And the second thing is, men also need to understand that there's a difference between who your male friends are with you as a friend and who they can be in relation to women. And that is something I think a lot of men struggle with. There's an idea of, this guy is my friend, or I know him in this capacity, and he is a good guy. Therefore, this person's obviously lying. This person's obviously trying to get attention. I would say withhold all of those assumptions and just really sit and deal with the fact that work through it. I'm not saying, believe absolutely every accusation that you hear, but this sort of dismissive behavior of my friend would never do that or my father would never do that is something I think really needs to change. Understand that there are perpetrators among you, and sort of really be against it to the point where you don't want to be associated with a perpetrator.
Mm. And it's really important that you alluded to the different forms of violence that take place. The emotional abuse that takes place, the physical abuse, and I think when speaking about gender-based violence, there's generally an understanding that GBVs maybe physically, and I think that's something that most people take it to mean. But as you mentioned, it involves emotional abuse as well. So when you speak about instilling this fear within men, that they should be afraid of being perpetrators, how exactly should we go about putting this fear into men, making them worried about, am I going to be a perpetrator, these are the consequences? Amara?
Yeah, I think, when we speak about education, I think the reason we talk about it so much is because it's one of the few things in society that are sort of compulsory, and I don't think we use that enough. So most people that will attend some sort of school in their life, and that means that school itself needs to be a tool that you can use to change society. So, in terms of what you learn at school, the way that you learn at school, how you are addressed at school, at a very, very young age, I'm talking like preschool, primary school, that level, I think it really needs to be instilled from then that these are the problems that we have in society. I'm not saying teach your kids all the gruesome details of GBV, but small things like who does this in your class, who does that in your class, in your home life, how is this supposed to work, how is that supposed to work, are girls in your class less than the boys in your class? Small questions like that, I think, really, really small conversations like that need to be had so that by the time boys become men, there isn't this sort of underlying thing that they've always been told that they are somehow better. That's something I think that really needs to happen from a very young age. We say things like, that starts at home and that needs to be taught at home. But to be honest, I think that there are too many adults that sit with these misogynistic values. And I think that's why these values aren't being taught at home, because it's pretty much antithetical to the way that people live in their homes. Um, the other place I think that South Africa in particular needs to be using more is religious spaces. So South Africa is quite a religious country. Um, I mean, albeit we are diverse in religion, but we are quite religious. And I think religious spaces need to be driving a sort of different morality where being a perpetrator of GBV is not something that's acceptable, and it's not something that can be sanitized by you praying. So I would say that those two are probably the most neglected, education and religious sector.
All right, thank you so much for that. We just have a few minutes remaining of this discussion, and we're gonna begin wrapping up this discussion. But there's still a lot more to discuss. In fact, we've barely touched this topic. In fact, there's so much to unpack here. And Mara, I'm sure you'd recall a few months back we had the similar discussion. We also discussed gender-based violence, and it's sad that we've got to discuss this once again. And unfortunately, to me, it would appear that not much has changed since then. And it's quite a long time since we've spoken about this on the show previously. Uh, so when we last spoke, you spoke about the legal system, and I think you said that the laws within the country uh, they are adequate to address this issue of gender-based violence. But I want to get your thoughts on this, Elizabeth. Do you think South Africa has adequate laws to eradicate and prevent gender-based violence? Does the law is it strong enough to deter men from perpetrating these acts of violence?
Thank you very much, Zahid, for that question. I am actually in agreement with Amara. We do have adequate laws. Yes, there are a few gaps here and there which are still being addressed and which just need to be plugged in. But in terms of really substantive laws, we do have substantive laws that protect that are supposed to protect women and children, and that are supposed to punish perpetrators of gender-based violence. But the problem comes at implementation. Things don't always work as they are supposed to. For instance, when you're looking, I can give an example. For instance, when a woman goes to a report case at a police station, and she gets to the police station, and she finds a law enforcement official, and she reports her case, and then the law enforcement official tells her that he doesn't believe that she has been violated, and that she must go back home, and she must deal with, it's a private matter, she must deal either with her partner or with her husband. uh, so things like that, those are issues, those are when we would look at cases of gender-based violence and the problems that are within the criminal justice system. Those are things that come out to indicate that women are not being believed even at the point of police stations, and sometimes even be in their own homes with people, with even their family members, which is what Amara was also speaking to. Women are not believed. So it's, if the law enforcement official is not taking that report seriously, then who is going to take that report seriously? How is that matter even going to go to court if it's not taken seriously? We have instances where uh, if you look at the numbers of the perpetrators of violent of gender-based violence, particularly looking at sexual offenses, many of the perpetrators are actually repeat offenders. So these are people who have been in jail, who have perpetrated that very same act before and felt that there was no consequence and they could do it again. Now that is a problem. If our criminal justice system cannot deal with that, that is a big problem. So it
Mm,
just shows you how difficult it is, despite the fact that we have these laws. Certain things that happen which are not supposed to happen within the criminal justice system. The ones who are supposed to enforce the law have no understanding, have a lack of understanding of what gender-based violence is and its impact and the harm that it causes to those who have been violated. And this is what is a serious problem, which is why we keep saying, education is very important. So
mm.
yes, we do have laws in the country. We have a beautiful constitution in South Africa. But if you look at the gender inequalities, the structural inequalities within our country, it's almost unbelievable. Violence is such, it's normalized within our society. Yet we have this constitution that really speaks to basic fundamental rights, which is hailed as one of the best constitutions in the world. But still, our people keep being violated. There are
Yeah,
gaps that
and
we exist.
mm, I think those are some of the gaps which I think really need to be plugged as soon as possible if we are to, successfully combat the issue of gender-based violence from a legal perspective. And interestingly, you mentioned women not being believed. Oftentimes by police and law enforcement officials. So when police and law enforcement officials are not willing to take up these cases because they do not believe them, simply because they do not believe the women who are coming to actually report these incidents. I think this Police Minister Becky Kerr also recently spoke about this, and speaking about what he said a few days ago, he mentioned that there is, on the part of women, there's tolerance to a certain extent of gender-based violence. Uh, your thoughts on this? Blaming women, if not entirely, at least partially, for tolerating the gender-based violence that happens to them. Your thoughts on this, Elizabeth?
I think it just goes back to the lack of understanding of the impact of gender-based violence. It affects us. I think Amara spoke to this. It affects us physically, it affects us emotionally and psychologically. If you do not understand the psychological impacts of gender-based violence, it's easy for you to blame the victim. And this is what happens in many instances. It's either, how did she get raped? Where was she? What was she wearing? That has nothing to do with the harm that has happened. And many instances, the blame is on the survivor. If you're looking at instance in terms of sexual offenses, There's so many cases where babies even have been raped. So are you going to tell me that you're going to question what the baby was wearing? I mean, it just
Mm,
doesn't. It's
yeah.
ridiculous. So really,
All right.
some of these things can be addressed by education and
Mm.
understanding the impacts of gender-based violence and the harm that they cause.
All right, we have just about 2 minutes remaining, so I want to give each of you a chance to, share your final thoughts on this topic. In closing this topic for this evening, of course, we're closing it for because we have time limits and time restraints on the show itself. But of course, the campaign should continue off air as well. So your final thoughts, Amara, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, I think thank you so much, firstly, for having these discussions. And you did mention that we spoke about this before, but I'm glad that we keep revisiting it. Obviously, I hope we get to a stage where we don't have to keep talking about it, because I hope we get to a stage where it's solved. But yeah, I think when we look at an issue as big as this, it almost feels like it's too big to solve. But I think what's important to know is that we have to actually continue believing that we can solve this. Otherwise, there's pretty much no point in trying to fix anything. So, as big as it really is the small instances that start helping a movement like this. And I'm saying that purposely because I don't think 16 days of activism in and of itself is going to do much. It's been around for a very long time and it's not doing anything. If someone approaches me and tries to violate me, and I tell them, weren't you paying attention in 16 days of activism? I know that that's not going to protect me. So I think we really need to do the work in terms of what is substantive protection against violence. And yeah, I think just everyone needs to realize that there is a part for them to play, and you don't have to be part of any ideology or movement in particular to do that. It really is you in your personal life taking a stance and saying, I will never ever be a perpetrator.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. The what you mentioned in your closing and parting shots, a really important sentiment once again. And I do hope that we don't have to have this conversation many more times until GBV is eradicated. And I think. It's a really big issue. We also need to start assessing how effective these campaigns have been, because it seems we have 16 days of activism. I think at one stage it was even extended to 365 days of activism against gender-based violence. But we have these campaigns, but it seems as though the trends are on the rise. uh, at least of what is being reported, it seems that gender-based violence seems to be on the increase. So I think it's about time we begin assessing how effective these strategies have been, and that's a total different. It's another conversation on its own. We can take up much more time, but I think it's already 8 p.m. and I think. I think for tonight we've got to wrap up. Your final thoughts, Elizabeth?
Thank you very much, Sir Wade. I think the fact that we're having these conversations tells us that we are uncomfortable about the issue, and when we're uncomfortable about something, it means that it's making us not. We feel the need to do something. We feel the need to address it, and that's important. Feeling that need, it directs us and it motivates us to act. And action against gender-based violence is what we need. As the Foundation for Human Rights, we're currently rolling out a program that is called Masiban Bisani, which really is about getting local communities to strengthen the response against gender-based violence, to empower local communities to be the first responders to gender-based violence within where they live, within their streets, for them to be able to take the power and the agency that they have, to be able to say, in this community, we are going to establish a gender-based free zone where women and children and men can feel safe. So it's really people within those communities, just as Amara was speaking to, that it really starts where you are. It doesn't have to be big things. Just start in the community, start in your home, start local, so you can be able to address the gender-based violence and strengthen the response to gender-based violence. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's where we are going to have to leave it for this evening. But just a quick recap of what we've spoken about this evening. I think we've spoken about the discrepancy between men and women when it comes to access to opportunities. We've spoken a lot about the sense of safety being non-existent when it comes when it comes to women living within our society. And then we've also spoken about the increase of gender-based violence. We've spoken about the economic impact as well. Gender-based violence does come with its own economic impact, and that's something Ms. Elizabeth Chiduri mentioned earlier on. And then we've also spoken about the different forms of violence that occur, emotional, physical violence that occurs and falls under gender-based violence. And we've also we've spoken about the way that our society sometimes, often, sadly, often rejects the testimonies of women when they say that they are being violated. It's often they often met with the response that they are lying or being untruthful or whatever the case may be. And I think that's also part of the lack of understanding which we spoke about when it comes to issues such as gender-based violence. But it's already 3 minutes past 8 p.m. Central African time. That's where we are going to have to leave it for this evening. Amara Gavda, Andrew Midzai, Elizabeth Chiduri, from the Foundation for Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
very
much.
much. Thank you for having us.
And of course, many thanks to the listeners as well for participating in this discussion and for tuning in. Remember, this discussion it should continue off air as well. It's not something that is restricted to the media. It's not something that's restricted to panel discussions. To campaigns as well. It's something that we should keep this conversation moving off air as well. And thanks to the technical team as well for putting this together this evening and keeping everything in order. But from myself, Zahid, Jadwat, and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.